Park Service and help support the effort. As many of you know, our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve Park Service resources at the landscape and seascape level. We host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars in our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to all DOI staff, and the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And importantly, the webinar series is open to other federal agencies, NGOs, and other partners. So feel free to forward other announcements for future webinars to your colleagues moving forward. There are already links in the chat box to our internal Park Service Toolkit, and then also, again, the Park Service site on the Network for Landscape Conservation website, where you can find background on and recordings of future and past webinars. Today's webinar will be recorded and again posted to both of those websites. And throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in questions into the question box. Following the presentation, we'll circle back and take a look at those questions that everyone entered and ask those to the presenters. Today's presenters are Emily Harkness and Bry Beltran with the Heart of the Rockies initiative. Emily is based in Missoula, Montana, and has a BS in zoology from Humboldt State University and a graduate certificate in natural resource conflict resolution from the University of Montana. She has spent the last 10 years working in the Rocky Mountains as a fisheries technician, horsepacker, and park ranger. Bry is based in Pocatello, Idaho, and works to promote conservation at the landscape scale while allowing compatible and adequate use by people to enhance our quality of life. Bry was born in on the Colombian Atlantic coast, but grew up in the Andean cloud forest. So with that, Emily and Bry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you everybody for tuning in to this webinar. We're really excited to show our experience through the High Divide Collaborative to hopefully potential future partners as we work across jurisdictional and political boundaries. And the more people that are on the bus, the better it is for the outcomes that we get on the landscape. So as Brian mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the High Divide Collaborative and basically about our conservation at the landscape scale through community-based collaboration, which is how we have approached conservation in the High Divide region. But before we start talking about the High Divide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Heart of the Rockies initiative. This is the only thing I'm going to say about Heart of the Rockies because, as I said, our concentration is on something, on a collaborative that we help facilitate. So Heart of the Rockies was created in 2002 by 22 independent local, regional, and national land trusts and conservancies. And the idea was that Heart of the Rockies will give some of a large landscape umbrella to the really valuable work that these organizations were doing at the local level across the Rocky Mountain corridor in Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Alberta, and BC. And our mission is to work together to conserve clean water, iconic Western landscapes, and the communities that depend on them. And with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of an outline. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit of history of the High Divide Collaborative and how the working landscapes in the High Divide Collaborative are really key to the connectivity across, between the three keystone ecosystems around the High Divide. We're going to talk about some of the successes that we have had in the High Divide, some of the current projects, and then we're going to hear from the actors on the ground themselves. And after that, we're going to go into the Q&A session. So to start, the High Divide region has conceptually existed since about the mid-1990s, and really it is right here, this blob of land in between the three keystone ecosystems in the region, which are the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem to the southeast, the Crown of the Continent ecosystem to the north, and the Salmon-Selway Wilderness Complex to the west. And that region in the middle, and depending on the day and depending on who you ask, we are going to give you different boundaries. Even if you ask me one day, or like, depending on that, I'm going to give you a different boundary depending on what we really want to ask about the high divide. But really, it is that blob in the middle that is a vast working landscape of about 25 million acres. And it's defined by providing the connectivity, as I mentioned, between the GYE, the Crown, and the Idaho wilderness. The high divide is also the headwaters of the Mississippi, Missouri rivers, and the Snake and Columbia rivers. And like I say, it spans across the continental divide between Idaho and Montana in the high desert. The high divide, because of its location, has some of the key issues are that public-private land interface is really connected. The ranching way of life that defines the region, it's really dependent on those public lands grazing allotments. But the identity of the region depends on that ranching identity that is given by the culture that is on the landscape. And on top of that, we have this continental wildlife linkage between the GYE, the Crown, and the central Idaho wilderness. And if you have those three things, you can then say, and then on top of that, many people recreate here. But you could also say, but many people recreate here. So how do we keep all of those values on the landscape and make progress together to promote the ecological integrity of the landscape, but also the social integrity and identity of the region? If you guys want to learn a little bit more about the High Divide Collaborative, please go to www.highdivide.org, and there's going to be a lot more information there. And just on connectivity, you know, just to break up this map a little bit, the purple lines are pronghorn antelope migration routes, and we can see right here, this is the Idaho-Montana border. We can see that there are antelope that come all the way from the Pioneer Mountains in Idaho and go all the way into Montana. We can also see all of the migration routes into and out of Yellowstone from the Sands Creek Desert in Idaho. And that's from, and this is actually a little outdated, but that's based on some actual telemetry data. If we run a circuitscape model, which is, you know, just a connectivity model that is based out of you know, just how the landscape would allow species to move through, we can see that that the high divide is really valuable for the connection between those three ecosystems. But and here, let me just show a little bit. So the dark green are Gap 1 and Gap 2 lands that are over 10,000 acres in the region. And then the faded green are the other public lands around that. Then we can see connectivity across public lands, but then we can see that connectivity falls out of those public lands and goes into private lands, making those private lands connections really important for connectivity across these ecosystems. So now we have to start thinking about, well, who are the players involved besides conservation organizations or public land managers that we need to engage to really look at connectivity across the region, and what are the values that they have on the landscape. And then just to give you an idea on perhaps what some of the conflicts could be, here you have in gray, this is the structures in the landscape. So this is the Bitterroot Valley, which is pretty much built up. But all of this is where people live on the landscape. And we see that sometimes that overlaps on those corridor paths. So is it stewardship? Is it protection? What it is that we need to do, and who do we need to contact, and who are the people that need to work together to get work done to keep that connectivity happening, and at the same time have the support of the local community. So, you know, why the High Divide Collaborative? The High Divide Collaborative really try to build from the success of local collaboratives in the region. So really what we did was to use the social capital that we had built through these local initiatives to go and petition for money in DC to bring money to the landscape and really help us tie up the previous conservation investments in the region. So those local collaboratives in the Madison River Valley, in the Upper Henry's Fork, across the region have protected about 750,000 acres, investing about $440 million. And restoration projects added about 150,000 acres with 775 river miles with $18.7 million. So how do we protect that investment that already happened? So in 2012, under President Obama administration, there was the Collaborative Landscape Program, part of the American Great Outdoors, and there was LWCF money available for collaborative programs. So public land managers, conservation groups, and private land owners got together to see how they could bring that money to the landscape. And to do that, the start of that was, well, let's create some shared priorities. What are the things that we can agree on? There are a lot of things that we can disagree on, but that's not what we need to concentrate on. What are the things that we can agree on so we can move forward and we can collaborate with each other? And these shared priorities are on the website, highdivide.org. But just really briefly, what I want you to look at this is, like, you can see that the priorities are ecological and social priorities. It's not just one or the other side of the component. We're really looking at, just to get some technical or cliche with the literature, this is really a social ecological system, and we're treating it as that. We need to look at the social component and the ecological component if we're going to be successful with at achieving long-lasting conservation action on the ground. So to get to those shared priorities, we really needed to build a stronger collaboration, and that was really through community engagement. Our foundation as a collaborative requires the support of local communities and must derive from grassroots conservation needs. We invite all stakeholders to the table, we listen to the stakeholder viewpoints, learn their needs, and we incorporate their goals into the collaborative goals. Basically, what we do is we ask stakeholders about their values on the landscape and work from there. And let me clarify this. When I say we, I don't mean we, Heart of the Rockies Initiative. I mean we, the collaborative, because the High Divide Collaborative is not a project or is not a program of Heart of the Rockies Initiative. We're just the facilitators, and just like everybody else, we're also stakeholder. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys heard when I say we the collaborative, not we, Heart of the Rockies. So, and one of the things that we really needed to understand and come to terms with when we were building the collaborative, there was a lot of conservation groups, but we as a community needed to understand and accept that the landscape included people and families with dreams, really. So the idea is to conserve a safe place for wildlife, but also families and their businesses. I have a new favorite quote that I've been throwing around for a few weeks now, and to me it comes from a place I didn't expect. It's from the president of Sierra Club, and I always view the Sierra Club as an organization that kind of like, it's a protect first place, and then other social values might not be included in that. But what the president says, Aaron Mayer, I think you pronounce his last name, is you cannot protect the environment while failing to protect humanity. And that really strikes a chord with me, because if we really need to make sure that our conservation is long lasting, we have to bring the social component. And in the high divide, if we want to elevate it as a place where we have that continental connectivity linkage, we need to make sure that the social component of the landscape is also part of the solution. So the other things that we did is like the high divide is really a safe place for to voice our differences. And it's when I first came into the high divide, it really struck me that there were people that have very, very different views than others, and perhaps you couldn't see where the agreement would be between those two different stakeholders, but the dialogue was always civil, and providing that safe space where you can have differences was very important. Last, results matter. You know, if you're not going to go into a collaborative if you're not going to see results, if you're not going to see what that effort is going, what the change or the difference that effort is going to make. But another important thing is that it's not only that results count and matter, but that people that are involved know that their participation is what makes a difference in getting those results or not. And just to give you an example of like how that was built and like who came to the table, you know, here is a non-exhaustive list of people that are at the table, and including federal agencies, state agencies, the land trust conservancies in the region, businesses and sportsmen in conservation and other conservation organizations. And with that, I'm going to give it to my colleague Emily, and she's going to talk about some of the accomplishments and what we're doing right now.
Great, thanks, Bri. So as Bri had mentioned, the High Divide Collaborative was really formed as a way to access funding from LWCF and create these lasting partnerships in the High Divide landscape. And in 2016, 17, and 18, we were successful in getting around $30 million from LWCF to put back onto the landscape through these conservation projects. And one example of those projects is the Holland Family Ranch, which is just west of Dillon. And this effort was spearheaded by the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, along with the willing landowners, in purchasing this 320-acre inholding in the National Forest. And over 20 partners in the High Divide Collaborative came together on this project, and that 320-acre parcel is now open to the public for multiple uses: hiking, hunting, fishing, as well as grazing and other recreation activities. And it also preserved a quarter-mile segment of the Nez Perce Trail on that property. And so this is just one example of the projects that were accomplished, and one example of what we can achieve when we're bringing multiple stakeholders to the table. And so to build on this momentum, we hold an annual High Divide workshop, and we actually just wrapped up our 6th annual workshop last week in Idaho Falls. And this year we had around 100 people in attendance for this 2-day workshop. And we tend to have about 80 to 120 people who show up each year. And this year there was a big focus on developing new actions and learning from one another, and figuring out how we can continue this conversation and action between these annual workshops. And so one way that we turn our ideas into actions is through working groups. And one of our current work groups is focused on aspen restoration in the High Divide. And as this slide lets you know, this group exists to coordinate efforts across boundaries to enhance the extent, function, and resilience of aspen communities within the High Divide landscape. And this group is fairly new. We've met, I think, 4 times at this point, but it's a really diverse group that's committed to this landscape scale approach to address the decline of our healthy aspen communities. And those aspen communities are really an essential part of both the social and ecological fabric in the High Divide. Another project that we house and coordinate in the High Divide Collaborative is a landowner-led agricultural conflict reduction group. So it makes sense that as we find ways to connect or soften the landscape for animals to move, we also need to consider the impact that movement is going to have on families who make their living off the land. And our working ranch lands, as we mentioned, are really central to our communities. And with more wolves and bears moving through these properties, it's going to create more chance for conflict. So this partnership of landowner-led groups that's listed on the slide there has come together to really share the successes and challenges that they've faced ranching on a landscape with more carnivores. And through the local knowledge of these ranchers and funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, they've been able to access effective tools and programs to reduce conflict on their land. So on the next slide, it's going to show a few different ways that we've done that. Let that pop up. One of the big ones is just removing dead livestock from the landscape. It's a major attractant, and if we can get those attractants off of the land, we're going to greatly reduce the amount of carnivores that come onto these private lands and interact with this livestock. So of the around 9 million acres that's covered by this project, about 7 million acres of those have some sort of livestock removal program. And we apologize for, I mean, the photo is a little intense on the slide there. But that's the reality that a lot of these ranchers have to deal with, and it's a lot of work to move a 1,000-pound animal off of your property, and then where do you take it? So that next step is where these composting sites come in, and there's actually four composting sites now. One in the Big Hole, the Madison, the Blackfoot, and the Granite Headwaters regions, and that's where ranchers can take these dead livestock, get them off of their property, and put them into secure facilities so that those composting sites don't then themselves become attractants for bears in town. Another tool that they've been using is range riding, and right now I think the main range riding programs are in the Centennial and Big Hole valleys. And for folks who aren't really familiar with that, a simple rundown is having humans out riding and walking the landscape, being amongst the livestock out there. I mean, for one, just having a human presence has an effect on reducing carnivores coming into the livestock. They also provide a variety of other great tools for the ranchers. One is as simple as checking fence line, making sure that fencing is functional and fixing fence when needed. They also have trail cams set up in a variety of spots to keep track of carnivore movement and possible like wolf den sites or maybe kill sites. And they're skilled in tracking, so they're looking for any signs of tracks of carnivores or physical sightings of them, and they can move, potentially move herds around according to where they're seeing activity. Another great service they provide is just having an extra set of eyes on livestock can really help reduce death that occurs from either injury or sickness. So having more eyes on the landscape means that if there are sick or injured cows out there, ranchers can get to them more quickly and address the issue. And the bottom two tools are fairly straightforward. Fencing attractants like calves and chickens. Also, beehives is a big one. On the reservation, there's a lot of beehives, and making sure that there's proper electric fencing to keep bears out of there has been a great resource. And then simple things, bear-resistant garbage cans and those more just like household garbage cans makes a big impact for communities that are seeing more bears traveling through. So next, I was just going to share some of the lessons that we've learned over time with the collaborative. And that first bullet point is really important. I mean, they all are, but I just really want to emphasize that importance to have an open dialogue and to listen to people. At our last workshop last week, we had a few ranchers in attendance, which is really great. They're such an important voice on the landscape. And one of them shared what she said was her simple secret to engaging ranchers in the conversation. And she said, when you meet a rancher, ask them a question. And when they give you an answer, ask them another question. They'll just be amazed and excited to know that you're interested. So with that, we wanted to let you hear from one of our champion landowners and ranchers, Merrill Beeler, who's over in the Lemhi Valley. So Brian's going to queue up a trailer for our official High Divide film that came out a couple years ago. It sounds like those of you listening through your phone, you will likely not be able to hear the audio. I think it will just come through the computer. So I hope you enjoy.
All right. Let's see here. All right. Brian, Emily, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. All right, there we go. All right, well, thanks for that awesome presentation and awesome sharing that amazing trailer for the High Divide film. So, everyone, if you have a question for Bri and Emily, again, feel free to enter that into the questions tab, and I'll read those to Bri and Emily. All right, so here's one for you. Love the High Divide trailer, most excellent. Thanks for the presentation. Where can folks get the full film, the High Divide film?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that one. So there's a couple places. We should have a link to it just on our website, again, that highdivide.org. Another great place to access it is just on the Vimeo, vimeo.com, and just search for High Divide film, High Divide trailer. And it was created through Grizzly Creek Films, and it should show up there. And you do not need an account, as far as I understand, to access
And
that.
Brian, if it's helpful, we can send you the link, and then you can distribute it as well.
Okay, great. Here's another question for you. All the groups listed for the collaboration hold the same ideology for landscape conservation. Where is there room for those who disagree with this?
Well, perhaps they. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the person asking the question actually means, because yes, they might hold the same ideology for large landscape conservation, but it's usually within their own jurisdictional boundaries, right? What we're trying to do here is how do we support our partners, and how do we facilitate work that really integrates Forest Service, BLM, and landowners, rather than it's like my boundary ends here, I cannot do anything beyond that, and then the other federal agency, I cannot do anything beyond that, and my management is different than your management, is different than the private landowner management. And yes, we all have large landscape visions that is very limited by our jurisdictions. So we're trying to open the dialogue across those jurisdictional and political boundaries to really accomplish that mission. So I think that it is right to say that perhaps that's a view, but it's limited, and we're trying to facilitate it. The room for the people that might not have that, it's the same platform. Like, just because we have agreed on that doesn't mean that we're not going to listen to somebody that has a different view, and we would need to listen to that and be able to respond to that accordingly. So that's the way that I would answer that question.
Great. All right, here's another one for you. In the High Divide and surrounding region, is there an inventory of potential willing sellers to the federal government in order to connect wildlife corridors? Also, which agencies typically purchase the parcels?
So the parcels are, if it's LWCF money, it's Forest Service and BLM. That's where the money comes to, and yeah. And then as far as the list of properties, I don't think there is one. We have worked with the real estate office out of Missoula, and they know, and they actually use as partners, like where can we do work. But that's the work that our on-the-ground partners, particularly the land trust in the region, I said we were created by 22 land trusts and conservancies in the region, and those are the ones that have the local connections and the local knowledge of who might be willing to sell property. And sometimes that willingness to sell does not include willingness to sell to the federal government, and that's why these local partnerships are really valuable. And one of the things that we have really talked about is, it'll be great if the conservation funds had a little bit more flexibility in the way in which they can be invested, because a lot of sometimes there is a lot of trust in the local organization, but there's not a lot of trust in the state or the federal organization in holding an easement. So that is one of the sticking points that we perhaps run into sometimes. But it's more, we rely on the local knowledge of, or not on the local knowledge, we rely on the knowledge and relationship of our local partners in knowing where those transactions can happen, rather than having a list. And there might be one, but I'm not sure there is one.
Right.
Or I'm not aware of one.
I would also add to that, Bri, that example of the Holland Ranch, where it was a fee title, that land was sold to the Forest Service. That as a general rule, the collaborative actually encourages more easements because of the taxes that brings back to the community. So when it's sold to a public into public land, right, they then do not pay taxes that would come back to the county. So that was sort of one sort of unique project, but just as a general statement, I would say encouraging more easements for tax purposes is important.
Great. And here's another one relating to connectivity and the broader effort. How does the High Divide and all the partners, how do they focus on identifying and focusing efforts around different migratory corridors?
That is an ongoing effort, and actually one of the conversations that we had this past week in Idaho Falls during the High Divide meeting was the creation of a connectivity working group. And right now, we rely a lot on the work of our land trust partners to connect those public lands through private lands that are under easement. But as data and science becomes available, we are trying to guide that on-the-ground action by the science that becomes available. So that connectivity map that I showed there, I don't know if some folks might be familiar with the grizzly bear movement model between the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and the GYE ecosystem that came out last year, I believe. As that science becomes available, then we need to be able to have conservation plans that are flexible enough and that we can respond fast enough to the information. So then we can have science guide our action, which sometimes is opportunistic because we need to rely on a willing landowner and then to be able to do a project. So it doesn't matter how important the parcel is ecologically. If we don't have a willing landowner, we cannot do the work. So we need to create those relationships to have willing landowners to know the work that we do, and then be able to be able to do the work. But then, if we just support that across the landscape and we have a robust relationship with communities, then our work becomes less opportunistic and more guided by the science, where we can say, here is what the science is telling us, then can we actually do the work there, rather than saying like, well, this is where we have the opportunity, we are going to do the work there. And we're going to be better off, because by protecting land, I don't think, by protecting private land, I don't think that we are worse off, and we're going to be better off by that protection. But is that the best investment? And we don't know if we don't have the science. So as the science becomes available, we are informing that on-the-ground decision-making, which then is becoming a little more, it's less opportunistic and more guided by the knowledge that we have.
Great. Can you talk a bit about your work with Native American communities? Are there any lessons learned in your efforts?
That's a very important question. And I think the lesson learned for me is whatever we're doing is not working. And we unfortunately don't have as much tribal engagement as we would like. There have been a handful of conversations, but there is no current meaningful engagement for the tribal communities across the High Divide. I live in Pocatello, Idaho, where I am 12 miles from Fort Hall, and I don't have any connections. I think that the lessons learned are, for me, is keep knocking on the door, be respectful, and come to their door and ask about their values, so we can include them, and we have a platform where Native American cultures feel invited. But that's all my feeling. and it's not based out of any experience, because we really have not been successful and need to do better in that aspect.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I agree with everything Bri has just said, and as a coordinator who I just came on full time 2 months ago, there really hasn't been a dedicated coordinator for the High Divide up until this point, and it's certainly something that is at the front of my mind as a goal for myself over the next year, is to find ways to be more inclusive as a whole in the collaborative. So I appreciate that question. It is really, it's something we really need to work on.
Great. How about involvement in the High Divide collaborative efforts from the counties and some of the cities? Like, have they been engaged? Are they thinking about smart growth or planning around trying to conserve or not have development smack in the middle of some of those migratory corridors or particular lands that are really critical?
Yeah, so we have had a few county commissioners come to the meeting throughout the years, and I think that the feedback has been very positive. And one of my colleagues, Brent Brock, who is a consultant out of Bozeman, he actually developed a tool that he calls Wild Planner that I'm pretty sure is now incorporated into the Madison County development plan. And what Wild Planner does is, it takes the modeling constraints and it puts a structure, let's say, in the middle of a corridor, and see how that corridor would be split, or if the corridor shuts out. And those conversations are conversations that we're having, and it's informing not only it's informing local decision makers when they come, but it's also informing our land trust partners that can go back to their communities and start informing that. So there has been some of that, and I think that as we move more into action, we will see more of that coming through the pipeline and being incorporated more. That's actually one of, if this works long term, which I have faith that it would, that is one of the outcomes that we would like to see smart growth. How do we make sure that the information that we're providing here, or that we're creating here, it's making it into actual on the ground decision. And so far we've been very successful at informing the type of ecological conservation decision, but then we want to also be able to inform those development decisions. And Future West is a very good collaborator, very good planner and collaborator of ours, and they are involved in a lot of smart growth across the region. So that is a really valuable partnership as well.
Great. Here's another one for you. With all the different tools, conservation tools that different partners within your collaborative are using, do you have a sense for, where those conservation easements compare with, outright land purchases and other conservation tools?
I'm not sure I understand the question fully.
So for some of the private land, which makes up a lot of the land in the High Divide, I mean, do you have a sense for kind of the broad, for connecting those wildlife corridors and so on? Like, are some of the land trusts, a lot of them, like, just buying the land outright where they can, or is there a preference to doing just easements?
Yeah, so So the preference is to do easements. Land trusts are not in the business of owning land. It will take too much staff time and too many resources that these capacity and cash-strapped organizations do not have. And the idea is to not have an organization just hold a bunch of land and then kind of like make it a preserve. The idea is to keep these as a working landscape, keeping those families on the ground while giving them tools that allows them to be to be on the ground while keeping their operation running. And a lot of the time, the funds from these conservation easements is that financial shot that these families needed to make it and to survive on the landscape. But yeah, the idea is that conservation easement is the tool to keep the working lands working and to keep the people that are on the land, and to hopefully bring some vibrancy back, some economic vibrancy back to those communities where we're losing the younger generation out to the bigger urban areas, Boise, Missoula, Bozeman, Pocatello, because ranching it's not helping them make ends meet. So how do we keep those families on the land and keep those rural schools from closing because they don't have enough children? That's part of what we do, and part of that is conservation easements that are not held by the organizations, but rather by the private landowner. That is not to say that every now and then, occasionally, there is a purchase, but that is usually, and by usually I mean like over 95% of the cases, not the goal. And
Yeah.
and it's a combination, right? It's not just protection of the land, but it's also, so it's conservation and or like conservation, and the way that I see conservation is protection and stewardship. Sometimes it's like, you know, how do we make the land better? How do we restore this riparian corridor? How do we restore this stream through this property, either through fencing, so we can get salmon back, or whatever it is, while still allowing the cattle of the rancher to survive and get the water they need. So it's stewardship and protection. It's a combination of both across the landscape. Emily, you have something?
I was just going to add in, you just touched on it, the stewardship element of that is really important. And I'd say that's a really big incentive for easements over fee titles is that, you know, some of these families have been out stewarding and ranching this land for 4 or 5 generations, and helping, you know, learning from them. I mean, they just know a ton about their land, and learning from them some stewardship tools, as well as being able to provide some, is really advantageous.
Great. All right, here's one more for you. The High Divide Collaborative, how has it been affected, or has it been affected with some of the changes that have taken place for the landscape cooperative that the Fish and Wildlife Service managed?
That was a big, that affected us a lot. So the GNLCC, the Great Northern LCC, funded our effort for 2 years, and it was a science effort, but for a landscape conservation design project in this region, and not have, so that, what that really did was it made us have to shift my time to different projects, because now I wasn't, you know, my time wasn't 50% funded by the GNLCC to do work on the High Divide. So that changed a little bit. Thankfully, we were able to create a very robust relationships with researchers in Idaho that came into the landscape in the past 3 to 5 years as part of as the F-score program, and they were looking at large landscape conservation. So we were able to make that connection and kind of like make up that capacity that way. But that was one, and the other one is the capacity with our federal agency partners who then were reassigned to different roles and that couldn't either meet with us officially or that that just didn't have the bandwidth because they were assigned to other different things and they needed to respond to that. So it did it took a lot of capacity away from the effort. Thankfully, the partnership is robust enough that we were able to withstand that blow, but that's not to say that it wasn't a blow.
Great. All right, folks, I just entered into the chat box a link to the full High Divide film. So if you're interested in viewing the full film, I think it's 15 minutes or so. You can click on it there. It's also pretty easily, you can find it pretty easily on YouTube or Vimeo if you type in High Divide. All right, Emily and Bri, any last parting words?
I just have one more comment, and I realized I didn't give you guys our contact information. You guys can contact us. Well, you can go to contact us at our first name, Bri or Emily, at heart-of-rockies.org, and I'll be happy to chat with anybody that is interested or have any more questions about what we're doing over here. Other than that, thank you so much for your time and attention. We really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation and got something out of it.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Awesome. Thank you again so much, Emily and Bri, for all your great work, and good luck and moving forward with an exciting effort. Our next Connected Conservation webinar is going to be on May 15 at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, and we'll have the presenter from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation who will be talking about their grant programs, so you don't want to miss that. Again, our extensive calendar for the rest of the year can also be found at the Network for Landscape Conservation website. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye.